So this lecture segment is about Frederick Douglass and Newcastle University. Might be a bit unusual, but I want to actually start this lecture, and I have some very particular reasons for doing so. But I want to start this lecture with the governing document of Newcastle University, which is Newcastle University statutes. I won't read through the whole of it, but there is a very crucial part that I want to point out. And that is the section on academic freedom. The university shall ensure that academic staff have freedom within the law to question and test received wisdom and to put forward new ideas and controversial or unpopular opinions without placing themselves in jeopardy of losing their jobs or privileges. Where there is any issue as to the meaning of academic freedom, regards shall be had to sections 6 and 7 of the recommendation concerning the status of higher education teaching personnel adopted by the General Conference of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, in Paris on the 11th of November, 1997. I won't read through the entirety of sections 6 and 7 of the 1997 UNESCO Declaration, but I will point to this one section on self-governance and collegiality, which says higher education teaching personnel should have the right and opportunity without discrimination of any kind, according to their abilities, to take part in the governing bodies and to criticize the functioning of higher education institutions, including their own, while respecting the right of other sections of the academic community to participate. And they should also have the right to elect a majority of representatives to academic bodies within the higher education institution. So, that might seem a bit dry and boring and so forth, but I just wanted to be sure that everybody was clear about that before I start into this discussion of Frederick Douglass and Newcastle University. So we have a text that we're using as background for this, and this is from the Newcastle University website. We have the address here under the sort of who we are section. And it's about a statement by the university as a corporate entity about its relationship with Frederick Douglass, and obviously sort of serves as background to the establishment of the Frederick Douglass Centre, which was opened in November 2019. And the building aspect of that is part of the Science Central campus, which is a little distance from the main part of the campus. Now, as a historian, I look at documents. And so we are approaching this website and the statements on it as a document. So it has, near the top, a little section about who was Frederick Douglass, a short, very condensed sort of biography. And we learn that Frederick Douglass was born into slavery sometime around 1818 on a plantation in Talbot County, Maryland, USA. He became one of the most famous intellectuals of his time. He advised presidents and lectured to thousands on a range of causes, including women's rights and Irish Home Rule. On the 3rd of September, 1838, Douglass escaped from slavery in Baltimore. He disguised himself as a sailor and headed north, traveling by train and boat, first to Philadelphia, then on to New York. So, that's fair enough. Good little capsule biography of Douglass's origins, and he starts out in slavery and escapes. We then, just a little ways further down the page, we get a statement, a quotation, sort of put in different format and with quotation marks around it and Frederick Douglass's name underneath it. And the statement is this: I was born a slave, but I learned to read, and I escaped. Now this offers us another sort of bit of information about Douglass, and it says, in Douglass's own words, he says, I was born a slave, but I learned to read, and I escaped. And this is, I would suggest, a moment of transformation, the moment when he goes from slavery to freedom. And it's worth paying attention to the middle bit of this quote, because we can certainly see it as what it is that lifts Douglass out of slavery into freedom, and that is that he learned to read. So very appropriate, actually, for a university to recognize this. And it makes perfect sense that out of all of the, well, it's hard to say, hundreds of thousands at least, if not possibly millions of words that Douglass published during his lifetime, of speeches that he gave and so forth, this is a very good quotation to select out of that, to sort of make that point and to establish the logical connection between Frederick Douglass and Newcastle University, and to sort of emphasize the significance of education in overcoming difficulty and sort of transforming lives and so forth. So it helps emphasize the natural fit between Frederick Douglass and Newcastle University. It's a very pithy, concise little quotation. Just one problem. I haven't read everything that Douglass has written. I've read a lot of what Douglass has written, and I've also read an awful lot from the same time period. And when I read that sentence, I thought, that's interesting. This seems such a powerful, pithy, concise sentence. I'm surprised that it doesn't, immediately ring a bell in my head, and I can think, oh yeah, that's from this section of My Bondage and My Freedom, his later biography, or maybe it's from, this particular chapter in his original narrative that was published, or, oh yeah, that might be from one of his famous speeches, like, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. But when I read that sentence, it didn't ring any bells. So I did what any good scholar does in the middle part of the 21st century. I typed it into Google. And here we have a bit of what I would consider to be a problem. If you type that sentence into Google across the whole of the internet, however many, whatever it is, tens of millions, billion pages of information on the whole of the internet, you get precisely one hit. It appears only on Newcastle University's Frederick Douglass page. Now, considering how famous Douglass is and how much of his written work is published and is digitized in various formats all over the internet and so forth, you can really read almost anything that you need to read from Douglass, except for probably maybe some of the manuscript letters and so forth, but you can certainly read his published writings and nearly all of his well-known speeches on any one of a number of websites. We type in this quotation and we come up with nothing. Now, I want to emphasize this is a direct quotation. It's presented with Frederick Douglass's name under it, and it's presented in quotation marks. That's how we know it's a direct quotation. That's how scholarship in citing sources works. But we look, and it appears to turn up nowhere except on this web page. So I did the next thing that would make sense, and I thought, who are some Douglass experts that I know? I checked with one who's published a book on Douglass, actually knows the publication history of Douglass's work very, very well, has read pretty much most of the, if not all of the manuscript sources, and that scholar didn't know. I reached out via Twitter to a couple of others who I know, and Manisha Sinha got back to me quite quickly. She's the author about 5 years ago of what most people consider nowadays sort of the best overarching history of abolition, called The Slave's Cause. So I said, hey, Frederick Douglass experts, can anyone confirm if and where Douglass wrote or said the following: I was born a slave, but I learned to read, and I escaped? And Manisha said, if anyone should know, it is David Blight, who I also tagged in that, and I haven't heard back from him. He, meaning Douglass, does say and write in several places, "I was born a slave." The rest does not seem familiar, at least to me. So I would say that if we have asked 2 Douglass experts and Google for the source of this quotation and not found it, I don't think it exists. I think that this quotation, which is presented as a direct quotation, is not actually a direct quotation of anything that Frederick Douglass ever wrote or ever said. Now, it's possible that Douglass said something similar, a bit like the classic sketch by Morecambe and Wise with the pianist Andre Previn, with the classic line, "I'm playing all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order." So, it's entirely possible that Douglass said something along these lines, just not that particular quotation. So we need to think about, what does this quotation mean? As I said earlier, it makes perfect sense as a quotation to use for a university, to link a university to the most prominent abolitionist in the 19th century. The emphasis is on education and its sort of transformative, liberating power. And indeed, that is something that Douglass talked about in his narrative. He says, I'll just read this out for the benefit of anybody who might be listening to this and not looking at the text. At one point, while he's still enslaved, he describes learning to read. He says, "The plan which I adopted, and the one by which I was most successful, was that of making friends of all the little white boys whom I met in the street. As many of these as I could I converted into teachers. With their kindly aid, obtained at different times and in different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read. When I was sent on errands, I always took my book with me, and by going one part of my errands quickly, I found time to get a lesson before my return. I used also to carry bread with me, enough of which was always in the house, and to which I was always welcome, for I was much better off in this regard than many of the poor white children in our neighborhood. This bread I used to bestow upon the hungry little urchins who, in return, would give me that more valuable bread of knowledge." And Douglass goes on about this for about 3 pages or so, about learning to read and write in his narrative. So certainly education is a transformative experience for Douglass, and learning to read and write changes his life significantly, as it does for all of us, of course. However, that's not all of the story. In fact, I would suggest, and I think any actual scholar of Douglass would agree, that is not the key moment of transformation. The key moment of transformation for Douglass was when he directly challenged the power that was exerted over him to keep him enslaved. So his master, as Douglass gets to be older and sort of is coming towards adulthood and is becoming a bit more difficult to manage, sends him to work for a man named Edward Covey. And Edward Covey had a trade, as people did, and Edward Covey's trade was to be a slave breaker. That is to say, if you had an enslaved person and he wasn't doing what you wanted, and he was arguing and talking back and not working properly and getting a little bit too full of himself, a little too uppity for a slave, you sent him to Edward Covey, and Edward Covey kept him for a few months until he had him sorted out, had sort of broken his spirit, as one would an unruly horse, and sent him back to you, a nice, docile worker who would work without question, without hesitation, without challenge, and do as they were told. So Douglass's first experience, when he first goes to Covey, looking back on it, he writes, "If at any one time of my life, more than another, I was made to drink the bitterest dregs of slavery, that time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey. We were worked in all weathers. It was never too hot or too cold. It could never rain, blow, hail, or snow too hard for us to work in the field. Work, work, work was scarcely more the order of the day than of the night. The longest days were too short for him, and the shortest nights too long for him. I was somewhat unmanageable when I first went there, but a few months of this discipline tamed me. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me. And behold, a man transformed into a brute. So well done, Covey. He's done his job. He's taken somebody who was a bit unmanageable, who had a streak of independence and aspiration, and through violence and excessive overwork and threatening, broke his spirit. However, he didn't quite succeed. A little bit later, whatever little spark is in Douglass sort of fans into a small flame again, and Douglass challenges Covey. And in what's actually one of the most famous scenes of confrontation in 19th century literature, probably, without question, the most famous moment in Douglass's story, Douglass challenges Covey. And he fights back. And, not to put too fine a point on it, he beats up Edward Covey. So he, meaning Covey, asked me if I meant to persist in my resistance. I told him I did, come what might, that he had used me like a brute for 6 months, and that I was determined to be used so no longer. With that, he strove to drag me to a stick that was lying just out of the stable door. He meant to knock me down. But just as he was leaning over to get the stick, I seized him with both hands by his collar, and brought him by a sudden snatch to the ground. By this time Bill came. Covey called upon him for assistance. Bill wanted to know what he could do. Covey said, "Take hold of him, take hold of him." Bill said his master hired him out to do work, and not to help him whip me. So he left Covey and myself to fight our own battle out. We were at it for nearly 2 hours. Covey at length let me go, puffing and blowing at a great rate, saying that if I had not resisted, he would not have whipped me half so much. The truth was that he had not whipped me at all. I considered him as getting entirely the worst end of the bargain, for he had drawn no blood from me, but I had from him. The whole 6 months afterwards that I spent with Mr. Covey, he never laid the weight of his finger upon me in anger. He would occasionally say he didn't want to get hold of me again. No, thought I, you need not, for you will come off worse than you did before. So this is, as I said, probably the single most famous bit of Douglass's narrative. And pretty much every Douglass scholar thinks of this as transformative. In fact, it's a very good example of something called chiasmus, which is the idea of a crossing point, a sort of turning point, which is very common in African American literature. It's also a very important part of religious discourse in the 19th century, in the United States particularly, with the emphasis on evangelical religion and conversion experiences and so forth. But don't just take the word of scholars for the significance of it. Let's see what Douglass has to say about this. And he says, and I quote here, this is from his narrative, I haven't put quotation marks around it here, but this is a quote from the narrative. You can look this up. Douglass writes, "This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with a determination to be free." So, here we have Douglass's statement about the connection between his enslavement and his freedom. And the key thing is resisting the oppression that was heaped upon him, resisting the people who were deliberately trying to break his spirit. He does talk about reading and writing and learning and so forth. He doesn't say what's in that quotation on the webpage, but what he does say is the turning point in my career as a slave, the connection between being enslaved and being inspired again with a determination to be free, is standing up when people were trying to do him harm. That's the significant transformation for Douglass. The change in emphasis is really significant. If we accept the made-up quote on the webpage, it diminishes Douglass's agency. Education is given as a gift by Mrs. Auld, who was the wife of his master, who taught him letters and initially sort of taught him the basics of the alphabet before her husband said, don't be teaching this enslaved young man how to read. And also the white boys, who were very kind to teach him to read and so forth. The other thing it does, of course, is it leaves out Douglass's challenge to illegitimate authority. Freedom is treated in a similar fashion. So freedom is given to him by the Richardsons in Newcastle and the subscribers to the fund. Now, that actually did historically happen. But if we think about what is the turning point, Douglass doesn't say the turning point was when the Richardsons in Newcastle and the people who contributed to the fund paid off the man who claimed to own me back in Maryland. He says quite clearly the turning point was the struggle with Covey. The turning point was, to quote Byron in Childe Harold, the idea that people who want to be free have to take the initiative themselves. And it casts the idea of freedom a little bit along the lines of a very good book by Marcus Wood about how emancipation is represented in the Atlantic world. And the phrase that he comes up with for the title of this book is the horrible gift of freedom, that freedom was given to people and it caused all sorts of problems, and emancipation was difficult and so forth and caused problems. And the idea that this is a gift, but it's actually slightly horrible. But the key thing here is this change in emphasis diminishes Douglass's agency. Douglass became free not because Mrs. Auld taught him his letters, not because the white boys in Baltimore helped him learn to read a book. Douglass became free because he decided, when Covey had broken his spirit and nearly crushed out all hope that he had, Douglass decided, you know what? I'm going to stand up. And there were lots of other enslaved people who did the same thing and didn't succeed and didn't escape. But Douglass did. And Douglass had a significant platform for the rest of his life because of his skills as a writer, as an orator, as a leader, as a communicator, to tell people about slavery and about resistance to slavery. And what he said was, what's important is you have to stand up for yourself because nobody's going to give you freedom. That's what Douglass says. Why does this matter? Well, first of all, this quotation on this website is fabricated. That's simply unacceptable amongst scholars. If students did that, if the first-year students listening to this did that, you would actually find yourself in rather serious trouble. You can't just go around making up quotations. And again, we know that it is presented as a direct quotation because Douglass's name is on it and it's enclosed in quotation marks. It's presented and we are supposed to understand it as a direct quotation. I simply can't express clearly enough what a big deal this is amongst scholars. We might use one quote instead of another. We might get the wrong end of the stick and misunderstand something. We might make an argument that is just goofy and doesn't make sense and is contradicted by lots of other evidence. All that is within the rules of good practice of scholarship. What we can't do, what gets you drummed out of the profession as a serious scholar, is making stuff up. The other thing, of course, is that when we see that quotation on that webpage and we realize it's not real, it's made up, it makes us question the other statements on that page. And that's very unfortunate.